In the vast, arid landscapes of western Sudan, a region known to the world as Darfur, lies a city of historical importance. This city is El-Fashir. It has long been a crossroads for trade. It has long been a crossroads for culture. It has long been a crossroads for power. For centuries, it was the capital of the Darfur Sultanate, a center of life in an often harsh environment. Today, it stands as a symbol of a story that is both complex and deeply tragic. The land around it is a tapestry of diverse ethnic groups, ancient traditions. Yet this same land has become a canvas for one of the 21st century's most devastating conflicts. A struggle that has captured global attention yet remains profoundly misunderstood by many outside its borders. The story of Darfur is not a simple one. It is a story of deep historical roots, of land, of identity, of power. The conflict that erupted here has many names and many faces. It involves governments, rebel groups, local militias. It has drawn in the international community, from humanitarian agencies to global superpowers. El-Fashir, the capital of North Darfur state, sits at the very heart of this turmoil. Its streets and the surrounding plains have witnessed immense suffering. The city has become a sanctuary for hundreds of thousands of displaced people, a fortress, a front line. Understanding what has happened here is essential to understanding the wider tragedy of Darfur. This is the Darfur story you may not have been shown. It is a story often reduced to simple headlines or brief news reports. These snippets of information can rarely convey the full scale of the situation or the intricate web of causes and consequences. The world has seen images of suffering, and it has heard calls for action. But the specific role of key locations like El-Fashir and the precise sequence of events that unfolded there often remain blurry. Our journey today will focus on this city. We will look closely at its significance and the chain of events that have defined its recent history, shaping the lives of millions of people in the process. This narrative is not intended to shock, but to inform. We will navigate the difficult history of this region with care and with a commitment to clarity. The purpose is to build a clearer picture, piece by piece, using maps, and a clear timeline to guide our way. We will explore the geography and the peoples of Darfur. We will delve into the history that set the stage for conflict, and we will examine the specific actions and events centered around El-Fashir, which have had such a profound impact on the entire region. This is a story that deserves to be told with precision and with respect for the facts. Our aim in this documentary is to provide a clear, factual account. We will present a timeline of events using maps to illustrate the geographic context. This visual approach will help to clarify where key events took place, how populations moved, and how strategic control of territory shifted over time. The story of Darfur is spread across a vast area almost the size of France. Without a map, it is easy to lose one's bearings. We will use these tools to ground the narrative in the physical reality of the land, helping to make sense of the complex military and humanitarian developments as they unfolded. We have drawn our information from a wide array of credible sources: reports from United Nations agencies, research by non-governmental organizations, journalistic accounts from the ground, and academic studies. Our intention is to create a narrative that is balanced and grounded in verifiable evidence. This is a story filled with human tragedy, and it is our responsibility to approach it with sobriety and factual accuracy. The quiet, somber music you hear will continue throughout our program. It is intended to provide a space for reflection, not to manipulate emotion. The events themselves carry more than enough weight without the need for dramatic embellishment. Throughout the film, we will be following a clear chronological path. The story begins with the historical background of Darfur, leading up to the outbreak of major conflict. The middle section will detail the key events and actions that took place in and around El-Fashir, forming the core of our investigation. We will then explore the devastating human impact of these events and the international community's response. This structured approach is designed to build your understanding layer by layer, ensuring that the context is clear before we proceed to the more complex and harrowing details of the conflict itself. For those who wish to delve deeper, a detailed, time-stamped timeline of events will be available in the description of this video. You can use it to revisit specific moments or to see the entire sequence of events laid out in a clear format. Our goal is to provide a resource, a clear and accessible explanation of a difficult subject. The story of El-Fashir is a critical chapter in the wider story of Darfur. It is a story of survival, of loss, and of a struggle for justice that continues to this day. We invite you to join us as we explore the facts of what happened inside El-Fashir. Table of Contents. Part 2, Act 1. Background. History of Darfur. About 8 sections. Section 1, the land of the fur. Section 2, a mosaic of peoples. Section 3, the shadow of colonialism. Section 4, the seeds of marginalization. Section 5, El-Fashir, the Sultan's court. Section 6, the rise of grievances. Section 7, the first sparks of rebellion. Section 8, the government's response. Darfur, a name that translates to the land of the fur, is a vast region in the far west of Sudan. Its geography is a study in contrasts, a sprawling territory covering nearly 500,000 square kilometers. This is an area larger than the country of Spain. To the north, the Sahara Desert extends its sandy fingers, creating a harsh and arid environment where life clings precariously to scattered oases. In the center of the region rises the Mara Plateau, a volcanic massif that creates a more temperate, fertile highland. This central spine, with its higher rainfall and richer soils, has historically been the demographic and agricultural heartland of Darfur, a precious resource in a largely unforgiving landscape. The land itself has always been central to the lives of its inhabitants. The seasonal rains, or wadis, carve temporary rivers through the dry plains, dictating the patterns of settlement and migration. For centuries, communities have adapted to this challenging environment. Farmers have cultivated millet and other hardy crops in the more fertile areas. Nomadic pastoralists have guided their herds of camels, cattle and sheep across vast distance in search of water and grazing land. This age-old rhythm of life, a delicate balance between settled agriculture and nomadic pastoralism, has defined the social and economic fabric of Darfur. The land is not just a place to live, it is the source of wealth, identity and survival itself. This delicate balance, however, has always been fragile. The availability of water and fertile land is limited, and competition over these resources is a recurring theme throughout Darfur's long history. Periods of drought, which have become more frequent and severe in recent decades, place immense strain on this traditional system. When rains fail, crops wither and grazing lands shrink. This environmental pressure can exacerbate existing tensions between different groups, turning disputes over a well or a patch of pasture into wider conflicts. Understanding this fundamental relationship between the people and their environment is crucial to understanding the deeper roots of the modern conflict that would later engulf the region. The geography of Darfur has also contributed to its historical isolation from the centres of power along the Nile River. The vast distances and difficult terrain have often left the region on the periphery of the Sudanese state. This physical separation has fostered a distinct cultural and political identity in Darfur, but it has also led to a sense of neglect and marginalisation. The people of Darfur have often felt that their concerns are not heard and their needs are not met by the distant government in Khartoum. This long-standing sense of being on the outside, looking in, would become a powerful driver of the political grievances that eventually exploded into open warfare. Darfur is home to a rich and complex mosaic of ethnic groups numbering close to 100 distinct communities. These groups can be broadly, though often imperfectly, categorized into two main linguistic and lifestyle classifications. On one side are the sedentary, non-Arab agricultural communities. The largest and most prominent of these is the Fur, Masalit, Zaghawa. These communities have traditionally cultivated the more fertile lands of the region, particularly around the Mara Plateau, establishing villages and a settled way of life that has endured for centuries. Their identity is deeply tied to their ancestral lands, or Hakura. On the other side are the nomadic and semi-nomadic pastoralist groups, many of whom identify as Arabs. These groups, often referred to collectively as the Bagara, or cattle herders, have historically moved with their livestock across the plains of Darfur. Their lives are governed by the changing seasons and the search for water and pasture. Their identity is less connected to a specific plot of land and more to their lineage, their herds, and their nomadic traditions. For generations, these Arab and non-Arab groups coexisted in a system of interdependence. They traded goods, shared resources, and sometimes intermarried, creating a complex web of social and economic relationships that transcended simple ethnic lines. It is important to stress that the distinction between Arab and African in Darfur is not a clear-cut racial divide. It is primarily a cultural and linguistic distinction based on self-identification and way of life, rather than physical appearance. Decades of intermarriage and cultural exchange have blurred the lines considerably. Many groups who identify as Arab have lived in Darfur for centuries and are physically indistinguishable from their non-Arab neighbours. The conflict in Darfur is often portrayed as a simple clash between Arabs and Africans. But this oversimplification masks the complex local realities and the political manipulation of these identities for strategic purposes. This delicate social balance was managed for centuries through traditional conflict resolution mechanisms. Community elders and leaders would mediate disputes over land, water, or stolen livestock, often relying on customary laws to restore harmony. These systems were vital for maintaining peace between farming and herding communities, whose interests could often clash. However, as the 20th century progressed, these traditional structures began to weaken. The growing influence of the central state, combined with increasing environmental pressures and increasing economic pressures, eroded the authority of local leaders. This breakdown of traditional governance left a vacuum, making the region more vulnerable to manipulation and large-scale violence when new political tensions arose. Section 3. The Shadow of Colonialism. At the turn of the 20th century, Darfur was an independent state. The Darfur Sultanate was ruled by the Kaira dynasty of the Fur people. It had its own established system of governance, trade, law. This independence came to an abrupt end in 1916. During the First World War, the British, who controlled the neighbouring Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, grew suspicious of the Sultan of Darfur Ali Dinar. Fearing he might align with the Ottoman Empire, Britain launched an invasion. The Sultan's forces were defeated. Ali Dinar was killed. The ancient sultanate was formally annexed and incorporated into the larger territory of Sudan. This act marked a profound turning point in Darfur's history. The British colonial administration fundamentally altered the political and social landscape of the region. They implemented a policy known as indirect rule, governing through existing local structures where it suited them. They recognized the traditional land tenure system known as Hakura, which granted administrative rights over specific territories to certain ethnic groups. However, the colonial power also drew new administrative boundaries, reallocated land rights, sometimes favoring one group over another to maintain control. This system often solidified ethnic divisions, transforming what had been fluid relationships into more rigid, legally defined territories. These colonial-era decisions would have long-lasting consequences, creating grievances that would fester for decades. Under British rule, Darfur was largely treated as a remote and undeveloped backwater. Investment in infrastructure, education, healthcare. The colonial administration was primarily concerned with maintaining stability and extracting modest tax revenues, not with developing the region's economy or improving the lives of its people. This policy of deliberate neglect reinforced Darfur's isolation and marginalization within the broader Sudanese context. When Sudan eventually moved towards independence, Darfur was already at a significant economic and political disadvantage compared to the more developed and politically dominant central and northern parts of the country. The legacy of this colonial intervention was complex. On the one hand, the British conquest had destroyed Darfur's sovereignty and subjected it to the rule of a distant power. On the other hand, their system of indirect rule had, for a time, preserved some elements of the traditional social order. However, by freezing and formalizing these structures, the British made them less flexible and less able to adapt to future challenges. The colonial experience left Darfur integrated into a state where it was a peripheral player, its traditional power structures altered, its economic development stunted. This legacy of subordination set the stage for future conflicts over power and resources within the newly independent Sudanese nation. Section 4. The Seeds of Marginalization. When Sudan gained independence from Britain in 1956, political and economic power concentrated in the hands of a small elite from the central and northern riverine regions. This elite, largely identifying as Arab, dominated the new government, dominated the civil service, and dominated the military. The peripheral regions of the country, including Darfur in the west, the south, and the east, found themselves on the margins of the new nation-state. Decades of colonial underinvestment meant these regions lacked the roads, schools, and hospitals that were being built elsewhere. They also lacked political representation in the corridors of power in the capital, Khartoum. This post-colonial marginalization was not just neglect. It often became a deliberate policy. Successive governments in Khartoum viewed the diverse peoples of the periphery with suspicion. They pursued policies of Arabization and policies of Islamization, seeking to impose a uniform national identity based on the dominant central culture. This alienated many non-Arab communities in Darfur and elsewhere who felt their cultures and languages were being devalued and suppressed. Economic policies also favored the center. Major development projects and investments focused on regions around the Nile, while Darfur's traditional agricultural economy was left to stagnate. As the years passed, the gap between the center and the periphery widened. While Khartoum grew into a modern city, many villages in Darfur remained without electricity, without clean water, or basic health care. The political system offered little hope for change. A series of unstable civilian governments were interspersed with long periods of military rule, but the fundamental power structure remained the same. Darfuri politicians who tried to advocate for their region's rights within the system were often ignored or co-opted. This created a deep, growing sense of frustration and injustice among the people of Darfur. This systemic marginalization was fertile ground for political radicalism. The people of Darfur saw their land, their resources, and their political future being controlled by a distant, unresponsive government. They witnessed the state's failure to address recurring problems like drought and local conflicts. This prolonged political exclusion and economic deprivation created a powerful narrative of grievance. It was this narrative that would eventually convince a new generation of Darfuris that the only way to achieve their rights was not through a failed political process, but through armed struggle against the state itself. Section 5. El-Fashir, the Sultan's Court. El-Fashir, the city at the heart of our story, has long been the most important urban centre in Darfur. Its name, the Sultan's Courtyard, harks back to its origins in the late 18th century. Sultan Abd al-Rahman al-Rashid made it the capital of the Darfur Sultanate. For over a century, it was the seat of power, the administrative hub, and the cultural heart of an independent kingdom. The Sultan's Palace, or Fashir, was the centre of a bustling city. It attracted traders, scholars, artisans from across the region and beyond. It was a key node on the 40 Days Road, a major trans-Saharan trade route connecting Central Africa to Egypt. Even after the British conquest in 1916 and the dissolution of the Sultanate, El-Fashir retained its importance. The colonial administration established it as the capital of Darfur province, and it continued to be the main centre for governance, commerce and communication in the vast western region. After Sudan's independence, it became the capital of the newly created North Darfur state. The city was home to the region's main hospital, its most significant market, and what few government services existed. It was a melting pot where people from all of Darfur's diverse ethnic groups came to trade, work and seek services, living together in a relatively integrated urban environment. The city's strategic location gave it immense significance. Situated on the northern edge of the fertile Mara highlands and at a crossroads of routes connecting different parts of the region, control of El-Fashir meant control of North Darfur. It housed the main government and military installations, including a large army base and an airport. For any group wishing to challenge the authority of the central government in the region, capturing or at least threatening El-Fashir would be a primary objective. Conversely, for the government in Khartoum, holding the city was non-negotiable. It was the anchor of their power in the west. As political tensions grew in Darfur during the late 20th century, El-Fashir's role became increasingly complex. It was simultaneously the symbol of the central government's authority and a hub for the growing discontent among Darfuri intellectuals and activists. University students and educated professionals in the city began to articulate the region's grievances more forcefully, forming political movements that demanded greater autonomy and a fairer share of national wealth. The city was evolving from a simple administrative capital into a political tinderbox, where the aspirations of the Darfuri people would collide directly with the power of the Sudanese state. Section 6. The rise of grievances. By the 1980s and 1990s, simmering grievances began to coalesce into organized political movements. A new generation of educated Darfuris, many had studied in Khartoum, others abroad, returned with a sharpened political consciousness. They were influenced by other marginalized groups in Sudan, particularly the Southern Rebellion led by the SPLA. They saw parallels with other peripheral regions and framed their struggle as liberation from internal colonialism. Intellectuals wrote manifestos like the Black Book. It used census data to show systematic exclusion of Darfuris and other Westerners from power. The environmental situation became critical. A devastating drought and famine swept the Sahel in the mid-1980s, hitting Darfur hard. The desert expanded southwards, squeezing farmers and pastoralists onto shrinking land. Ecological crisis intensified competition for resources. Traditional agreements broke down. Clashes between Arab pastoralists searching for grazing land and fur farmers defending crops became more frequent and more violent. The government in Khartoum did little to mediate or to provide relief, deepening the sense of abandonment. In 1989, a military coup brought the National Islamic Front to power, led by Omar al-Bashir. The regime was ideologically driven and ruthless. It intensified Arabization and began to arm and support Arab militias in Darfur. Divide and rule proved effective. Modern automatic weapons entered local disputes, transforming community conflicts into militarized ethnic warfare, especially during the Fur Arab War of the late 1980s. These militias, later called the Janjaweed, were given free rein by the state. They were encouraged to attack and to displace non-Arab communities, particularly the Fur and the Masalit. The government provided weapons, logistical support, and, most importantly, impunity. State sponsorship fundamentally changed the nature of conflict in Darfur. It was no longer just a struggle over scarce resources. It was a politically motivated campaign of ethnic persecution backed by the central government. For many non-Arab communities, the state was no longer a neutral arbiter, or even just neglectful. It had become their primary enemy. Section 7. The first sparks of rebellion. Faced with state-sponsored violence and political exclusion, some members of the non-Arab communities concluded peaceful protest was futile. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, small, secretive groups began to form with the intention of launching an armed rebellion. Zaghawa, Fur, Masalit. They were often students, former soldiers, local community leaders. They began to gather weapons and train recruits, often in secret camps in remote hills. The two most significant rebel groups to emerge were the Sudan Liberation Movement Army, SLMA, and the Justice and Equality Movement, GEM. The SLMA was a largely secular organization. Its leadership was drawn from the Fur and the Zaghawa. Its stated goals were to end the marginalization of Darfur, to create a democratic Sudan, to create a secular Sudan, and to create a decentralized Sudan. GEM, on the other hand, had a more Islamist political orientation, though it was also committed to overthrowing the Khartoum regime and securing rights for Darfur. Despite ideological differences, both groups shared a common enemy: the government of Omar al-Bashir and its allied militias. In 2002, these nascent rebel groups began launching their first small-scale attacks. They targeted police stations, government outposts, military convoys. These initial operations aimed to capture weapons and supplies, to test the government's response, and to demonstrate their growing capability. The government in Khartoum initially downplayed these incidents, calling the rebels bandits and criminals. They failed to recognize the political nature of the uprising and the depth of grievances fueling it. This underestimation of the rebels' strength and determination proved a major strategic error. The turning point came in the early months of 2003. Rebel attacks became bolder and more coordinated. They were no longer just small hit-and-run raids. The SLMA, in particular, began to achieve significant military successes, overrunning several government garrisons and capturing towns. They showed surprising military skill and organization, often routing larger, better-equipped government forces. The conflict rapidly escalated from a low-level insurgency into a full-blown war. The first sparks of rebellion had ignited a fire spreading across Darfur, heading directly for the capital, El-Fashir. Section 8. The government's response. The event that shocked the Khartoum government out of its complacency occurred on the 25th April 2003. In a daring, brilliantly executed dawn raid, SLMA rebels, GEM rebels, stormed El-Fashir. They attacked the heavily fortified airport, a key military installation for government operations in the west. Rebels destroyed several military aircraft on the ground, helicopter gunships, Antonov bombers. They overran the army garrison, killed a large number of government soldiers, and captured the Air Force commander. A humiliating defeat for the Sudanese armed forces, a stunning victory for the rebellion. The attack dealt a profound psychological blow to the Bashir regime. It proved the rebels were not a minor nuisance, but a serious military threat to the government's power in Darfur. The government's response was swift and brutal. President Omar al-Bashir declared he would unleash the army, police, and tribal militias. He realized his conventional conscript army was ill-suited and poorly motivated for Darfur. He needed a different kind of force. The government mobilized and empowered Arab militias it had been cultivating for years. The Janjaweed were given weapons, funding, air support, and a green light to wage a scorched earth campaign. The strategy was simple and devastating. If you cannot defeat fighters in the bush, destroy the villages they come from. Burn the crops, poison the wells, and terrorize the population so they can no longer offer support, food, or shelter. This marked the start of the most destructive phase of the Darfur conflict. The response was not negotiation or reform, but mass violence against citizens. The army conducted aerial bombardments of villages, followed by Janjaweed ground assaults on horseback and on camels. They looted, burned, and killed with impunity. The violence was outsourced to proxy militias, giving the government deniability. The war in Darfur was about to become a humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions. Following the rebels' audacious raid in April 2003, the character of El-Fashir was transformed almost overnight. The city, once a relatively peaceful administrative hub, the commercial hub, became a heavily militarized zone. The government in Khartoum, reeling from the humiliation of the attack, poured troops and security personnel into the city. Checkpoints manned by nervous soldiers and intelligence agents sprang up on every major road. A palpable sense of fear descended upon the residents. The Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, established a tight security cordon around the city, effectively placing it under a state of siege. The primary goal was to prevent any repeat of the rebel attack and to use the city as the main launchpad for its brutal counter-offensive. The leadership in El-Fashir, composed of the state governor and military commanders appointed by Khartoum, was now tasked with implementing the central government's ruthless new strategy. Their decisions were no longer about local administration or development. They were about war. The city became the command and control center for the entire counter-insurgency operation in North Darfur. Military planners within El-Fasher's barracks coordinated troop movements, directed airstrikes from the now heavily guarded airport, and liaised directly with the allied Janjaweed militia leaders. The city's resources were completely repurposed for the war effort, with civilian needs taking a distant second place to military imperatives. For the city's non-Arab population, particularly the Fur, Zaghawa and Masalit, life became a nightmare. They were viewed with intense suspicion by the security forces, seen as potential rebel sympathizers or collaborators. Arbitrary arrests, disappearances and torture became commonplace. Young men from these ethnic groups were particularly targeted, rounded up in mass arrests on the mere suspicion of being connected to the rebellion. The trust that had once existed between different communities within the city began to evaporate, replaced by a climate of deep-seated fear and ethnic profiling. El-Fasher was no longer a melting pot. It was a city divided against itself. El-Fasher became a city of stark contrasts. Heavily fortified bastions of government power, the command centre for the war, and for many residents, a prison, especially for the wrong ethnic groups. Leaders implementing Khartoum's security-first agenda transformed the historic capital of Darfur into a citadel of fear. They secured physical control, but at the cost of justice, human rights, and the very soul of the diverse community. From their central command post in El-Fasher, the Sudanese military commanders began to actively coordinate with the Janjaweed militias. From their central command post in El-Fasher, the Sudanese military commanders began to actively coordinate with the Janjaweed militias. From their central command post in El-Fashir, the Sudanese military commanders began to actively coordinate with the Janjaweed militias. These were not disorganized tribal fighters. They were a well-armed and organized proxy force for the state. Leaders of the most powerful Arab militias were brought to El-Fasher for meetings. They met with military and intelligence officials. Here they received their orders. Here they received their weapons. Here they received their logistical support. The government provided them with satellite phones for communication. The government provided them with ammunition for their rifles. The government provided them with fuel for their vehicles. The Janjaweed were effectively integrated into the state's military apparatus, acting as the brutal frontline troops of the counter-insurgency. The pattern of attack was chillingly consistent and was directed from the operational centres in El-Fasher. First, the Sudanese Air Force would use Antonov cargo planes. First, the Sudanese Air Force would use helicopter gunships, flying out of El-Fasher's airport to bomb a target village. The bombs were often crude, unguided barrel bombs, dropped indiscriminately on civilian homes. The bombs were often crude, unguided barrel bombs, dropped indiscriminately on markets. The bombs were often crude, unguided barrel bombs, dropped indiscriminately on water sources. This aerial bombardment was designed to terrorize the population and soften up the target. It served to drive people out of their homes and into the open, disorienting them ahead of the main assault that was to follow. Shortly after the bombing, the Janjaweed would sweep in. They would arrive on horseback. They would arrive in pickup trucks mounted with machine guns. They were often accompanied by regular army soldiers. Their attacks were characterized by extreme brutality. They would kill the men. They would assault the women. They would burn the village to the ground. They would steal livestock. They would loot any valuables. They would deliberately destroy food stores. They would poison wells to ensure that the survivors could not return. This scorched earth tactic was designed to erase the villages from the map, to sever the link between the people and their land, and to destroy the social and economic fabric of the communities perceived as supporting the rebels. These coordinated attacks represented a deliberate military strategy, planned and executed by the state authorities based in El-Fashir. Eyewitness accounts from survivors consistently described seeing military vehicles and soldiers fighting alongside the Janjaweed. They reported hearing Janjaweed fighters communicating with military commanders via radio. The link was undeniable. The actions taken by the leaders in El-Fashir were not simply a defense of the city. They were the orchestration of a widespread and systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing across the rural plains of North Darfur. The city had become the epicenter of a state-sponsored slaughter. The direct consequence of the government's scorched earth campaign in the countryside was a massive wave of human displacement. Hundreds of thousands of people, their villages destroyed and their lives shattered, had nowhere to go. They fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs, seeking refuge wherever they could find it. Their primary destination was the relative safety of the larger towns. El-Fashir, as the regional capital, became a magnet for the displaced. They walked for days across the harsh, arid landscape, many dying from thirst, many dying from hunger, many dying from their injuries along the way. The survivors arrived at the outskirts of the city in a state of complete desperation. The initial response from the authorities in El-Fashir to this influx of people was one of hostility and neglect. The government, which was responsible for their displacement in the first place, saw these desperate civilians not as victims needing assistance, but as a security threat. They were the families of the rebels, a population to be controlled and contained. The authorities made little to no provision for their shelter, food, water. The first arrivals were left to fend for themselves on the sandy, windswept plains on the edge of the city, constructing makeshift shelters from scraps of wood, cloth, plastic sheeting. As the numbers swelled from thousands to tens of thousands and then to hundreds of thousands, a humanitarian catastrophe of staggering proportions began to unfold. Malnutrition and disease ran rampant in the squalid, overcrowded conditions. There was no clean water, no sanitation, and virtually no medical care. International humanitarian organizations, aware of the escalating crisis, attempted to gain access to provide aid. However, the government officials in El-Fashir, acting on orders from Khartoum, created a wall of bureaucratic obstruction. They denied travel permits, held up shipments of aid, and did everything possible to prevent the outside world from seeing and responding to the crisis they had created. This deliberate obstruction of humanitarian aid was a key part of the government's strategy. They wanted to hide the evidence of their brutal campaign and to continue to punish the displaced population. The decisions made by the leaders in El-Fashir at this time had fatal consequences. Every day that aid was delayed was a day that more children died of malnutrition and more people succumbed to preventable diseases like cholera, measles. The actions of the city's authorities were not just a failure to protect. They were an active and willful contribution to the suffering and death of a vast number of innocent civilians. As international pressure mounted and the scale of the crisis became impossible to hide, the government's stance on humanitarian access began to soften, albeit slightly. They allowed international aid agencies to establish a presence in El-Fashir, but under strict control. This led to the creation of massive formal camps for the internally displaced persons, or IDPs, on the city's periphery. Camps with names like Abu Shuk, Al-Salam sprang up, quickly growing into sprawling cities of tents, mud brick shelters. Organized by the UN and NGOs, providing food, water, basic medical care, saving countless lives. But these camps were not sanctuaries. They were open-air prisons, surrounded by government security forces and Janjaweed militias who had driven people from their homes. The IDPs were trapped, relatively safe from bombing inside, yet living in constant fear. Janjaweed patrolled the perimeters, leaving the camp to collect firewood or to seek work was life-threatening. Women, girls were especially vulnerable, systematic rape, sexual violence used as a weapon of war by militias. El-Fashir's governance had a dual role. Inside the city, military control. On the outskirts, presiding over enormous camps, managing the displaced. Authorities dictated where aid could be delivered, how it could be delivered, maintained heavy security to monitor IDPs, whom they viewed with suspicion. El-Fashir had become a fortress city, defending against rebel attack, while containing a captive population of over 100,000 traumatized, dispossessed, living in misery beyond the city's boundaries. The creation of these camps fundamentally altered Darfur's demography. The countryside was emptied of non-Arab farming communities, their lands often taken over by government-allied groups. Displaced people concentrated in urban camps, peri-urban camps, entirely dependent on international aid for survival. This was the long-term consequence from El-Fashir, not just defeating a rebellion, but re-engineering the social landscape, the ethnic landscape, through mass displacement and forced urbanization. By early 2004, the world could no longer ignore Darfur. Satellite imagery showed devastation. Courageous reporting by journalists exposed the truth. Humanitarian workers sent urgent reports from the ground. Senior US officials began using the term genocide. Human rights organizations used the same term. The international spotlight turned to Sudan. El-Fashir, the capital of North Darfur. El-Fashir, a hub for both military and humanitarian operations. High-level international delegations started arriving in El-Fashir. The UN Secretary-General arrived. US Secretary of State Colin Powell arrived. Various European foreign ministers arrived. They were met by government officials staging a carefully managed display. They were shown the model parts of the IDP camps. They were prevented from seeing the worst or speaking freely with the displaced. Khartoum's officials engaged in denial and obfuscation. They called the violence tribal clashes and dismissed genocide as an exaggeration to justify intervention. Still, international presence made a difference. It offered protection for humanitarian workers and, to a lesser extent, for the IDPs themselves. The most blatant atrocities became less frequent around the city. Large-scale massacres declined. Aerial bombardments near the city eased, but the violence became more insidious. Attacks on individuals outside the camps increased. The systematic use of sexual violence rose, and aid continued to be obstructed in remote areas. This was a major turning point. Actions around El-Fashir were no longer just a domestic matter. They drew intense international scrutiny and condemnation. That led to UN Security Council resolutions. Resolutions demanded the disarmament of the Janjaweed and called for protection of civilians. The resolutions threatened sanctions and hinted at possible intervention. Khartoum and its El-Fashir representatives were now on the defensive, while still pursuing military objectives on the ground. Section 7. The African Union mission arrives. In response to the escalating crisis, the African Union took the lead. In mid-2004, the AU brokered a fragile ceasefire. Government, rebel movements. To monitor the ceasefire, it deployed a small contingent, unarmed military observers, known as AMIS. El-Fashir was chosen as AMIS headquarters. The arrival of the first green-helmeted AU soldiers represented a new phase. The AMIS mandate was extremely limited. Initially, they were only there to observe and report, not to protect civilians. Their numbers were small. They lacked equipment. They lacked logistics. They lacked political backing. Government authorities in El-Fashir officially welcomed the mission, but in practice they often obstructed its work. AU patrols were frequently denied permission to travel to areas where fighting was reported. Janjaweed, government forces. Attacks were often committed within plain sight of the mission's observers. Despite its weaknesses, AMIS's presence in El-Fashir was significant. It was the first time an external military force had been deployed in the region. The mission provided a more reliable source of information on the ground. Their reports often contradicted the government's official narrative. For displaced people in the camps, the white vehicles of the AU patrols became a symbol of hope. They would often crowd around the peacekeepers, pleading for protection and recounting attacks. Over time, the mandate and size of AMIS were gradually expanded. They were eventually given a limited mandate to protect civilians under imminent threat and in the immediate vicinity. However, they remained chronically underfunded and under-equipped. For a region the size of France, the task was monumental. The key events in El-Fashir revolved around this constant struggle. The AU's attempts to monitor the ceasefire, protect civilians, and the government's persistent efforts to undermine the mission, continue its war against the rebellion by other means, all while maintaining a facade of cooperation. Section 8. A fragile and faltering peace. In May 2006, after years of negotiations heavily pushed by the international community, a peace agreement was signed in Abuja, Nigeria. It was known as the Darfur Peace Agreement, or DPA. The agreement was signed by the Sudanese government and only one of the major rebel factions, a faction of the SLMA led by Mini Minawi. The other major rebel groups refused to sign, including the main SLMA faction, GEM. They argued the agreement did not adequately address their core demands for power sharing, compensation, the disarmament of the Janjaweed. This division within the rebel movements was a critical failure. The government, through its officials in El-Fashir, immediately began to implement the parts of the agreement that suited its interests. Mini Minawi was appointed as a senior assistant to the President of Sudan and head of a new transitional authority for Darfur, which was to be based in El-Fashir. The government hoped this move would co-opt a major part of the rebellion and present an image of peace to the world. However, the plan backfired spectacularly. The non-signatory rebel groups saw Minawi as a traitor who had sold out to the government in Khartoum. The result was not peace, but a new and more complex phase of the war. The conflict was no longer a simple fight between the government and a unified rebellion. It now became a multi-sided free for all. The rebel factions that had refused to sign the DPA began fighting the faction that had signed. The government, meanwhile, continued its support for the Janjaweed, who were not disarmed as the agreement required. Violence across Darfur intensified after the peace agreement. El-Fashir, as the seat of the new contested regional authority, became a centre of political intrigue and a target for the disgruntled non-signatory rebel groups. The failure of the DPA was a devastating blow to the people of Darfur and a clear turning point in the conflict. It demonstrated that a partial peace did not include all major parties, did not address the root causes of the conflict, and was no peace at all. El-Fashir's leadership focused on propping up a failing peace deal and managing the fallout from its collapse. The city remained a fortress. The camps remained full, and hope for a genuine resolution receded. The cycle of violence had been given a new, more complicated spin. Section 1. The Anatomy of a Refugee Camp. The camps that mushroomed around El-Fashir were not temporary shelters. They became permanent, sprawling cities of despair. Life inside places like Abu Shuk, al-Salam, was a daily struggle for existence, a testament to human resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. The landscape was a monotonous sea of plastic sheeting, mud brick huts and dusty alleyways stretching for miles across the barren ground. These camps, housing hundreds of thousands of people, were among the most densely populated places on Earth. They were a world away from the villages the inhabitants had been forced to flee, a world stripped of dignity, purpose and hope for the future. The basic necessities of life were provided almost entirely by international aid. Every morning, long queues would form at water distribution points, where people would wait for hours to fill their jerry cans with clean water. Food rations, sorghum, lentils, oil were distributed by the World Food Programme. This aid was a lifeline, preventing mass starvation, but it also created a culture of total dependency. The men, once proud farmers, herders, found themselves with nothing to do, their skills and knowledge rendered useless. This enforced idleness eroded their sense of self-worth and contributed to social breakdown within the community. The social structure of the camps was complex. People tried to recreate the communities they'd lost, with families from the same village often clustering together in the same sector of the camp. They appointed their own informal leaders, or sheikhs, to represent them and to help manage the distribution of aid and resolve disputes. These community structures were vital for survival, providing a network of mutual support in a hostile environment. However, the camps were also rife with tension. Overcrowding, scarce resources, and the trauma of displacement created a volatile atmosphere where small disagreements could easily escalate into serious conflicts. The perimeter of the camp was a line between relative safety and extreme danger. Inside, people were shielded from direct military assault, but the world outside was controlled by their persecutors. The simple act of collecting firewood, a task that fell mostly to women, girls, became a terrifying ordeal. They would have to walk for miles into the surrounding bush, where they were systematically targeted for brutal attacks, including rape, abduction, by the Janjaweed militias. The camps were thus islands of precarious safety in a sea of violence, their inhabitants trapped by an invisible wall of fear. The physical wounds of the conflict were everywhere to be seen in the camps around El-Fashir. Medical clinics run by organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières were overwhelmed with patients. Gunshot wounds, burns, injuries sustained during their flight from their villages. But it was the invisible scars, the psychological trauma, that were the most pervasive and enduring. Almost every single person in the camps had witnessed horrific acts of violence. They had seen family members killed, their homes burned to the ground, their communities destroyed before their very eyes. This collective trauma cast a long shadow over the entire displaced population. Children were particularly affected. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, flashbacks, extreme anxiety. Aid workers reported seeing children who had stopped speaking altogether. In their drawings, they would depict scenes of planes dropping bombs and men on horseback burning huts, a stark and heartbreaking testament to their shattered innocence. The violence had robbed them of their childhood and left psychological wounds hard to heal. Sexual violence was used as a deliberate and systematic weapon of war. Women and girls bore the brunt of this horrific strategy. The rapes were not random acts. They were a calculated tool of humiliation and terror. For the survivors, the physical and psychological trauma was immense, and they were often stigmatized and ostracized. The fear of sexual violence confined women to the camps, limiting their freedom and ability to provide for their families. The international response to this mental health crisis was tragically inadequate. Aid agencies did their best to provide food and medical care, but the resources for psychological support were scarce. There were simply not enough trained counselors or mental health professionals. The people of Darfur were largely left to deal with their psychological wounds on their own, relying on their own resilience and community support systems. The scars of the violence, both visible and invisible, became a defining feature of the human impact of the conflict. A deep and lasting injury to the soul of an entire people. The conflict created a profound educational crisis, threatening to produce a lost generation of Darfuri children. In the destroyed villages, schools had ceased to exist. For those who made it to the camps around El-Fashir, the situation was only marginally better. In the early years of the displacement, there was no formal education system at all. Children spent their days idle, with nothing to do but wander the dusty alleyways of the camps. This lack of schooling deprived them of the chance to learn and build a future, and made them more vulnerable to exploitation and recruitment by armed groups. International organizations like UNICEF and community leaders worked hard to establish makeshift schools in the camps. These were often simple structures made of thatch or plastic sheeting with few books and even fewer trained teachers. Many of the teachers were volunteers from within the displaced community itself, doing their best to provide some semblance of an education. Despite the difficult conditions, the demand for schooling was enormous. Parents understood that education was the only hope for their children to escape the cycle of poverty and violence, and they would make great sacrifices to ensure their children could attend these basic classes. The curriculum in these camp schools became a quiet battleground for the future. The Sudanese government attempted to impose its national curriculum, which many of the displaced felt ignored their culture and history, and presented a biased narrative of the conflict. In response, community leaders and aid agencies tried to develop a curriculum more relevant to the children's experiences, one that focused on peace-building, human rights, and the preservation of their own cultural identity. The simple act of teaching became a form of resistance, an effort to ensure that the next generation would not forget who they were or where they came from. Despite these heroic efforts, the quality of education remained extremely poor, and opportunities for secondary or higher education were almost non-existent. For a generation of young people who grew up in the camps, their entire educational journey took place within these makeshift classrooms. They were denied the chance to develop their full potential, their prospects severely limited by the circumstances of their birth and displacement. This educational void represents one of the longest-lasting and most tragic consequences of the conflict, a theft of human potential on a massive scale that will impact Darfuri society for decades to come. By 2007, AMIS was under-resourced and unable to cope with the scale of violence in Darfur. Following intense diplomatic pressure, the Security Council passed Resolution 1769. The resolution authorized UNAMID, a joint African Union-United Nations hybrid mission. It was a landmark decision, creating one of the largest and most complex UN missions. Its headquarters were established in El-Fashir, which became the nerve center of the operation. Deployment began in earnest in 2008, bringing thousands to El-Fashir. Peacekeepers, police officers, civilian staff from dozens of countries. The mandate was more robust than MIS, tasked with the protection of civilians, facilitating the delivery of humanitarian aid, supporting the peace process. The sight of blue helmets and white armored personnel carriers became common. But UNAMID faced many of the same challenges. The Sudanese government used bureaucratic obstruction. UNAMID patrols were often denied access to conflict zones. Their ability to use force to protect civilians was severely constrained. The mission was frequently criticized as too passive. Peacekeepers often became little more than witnesses to ongoing violence. Despite these limitations, UNAMID's presence had tangible impact. Patrols provided a measure of security around IDP camps. They reduced the frequency of militia attacks on perimeters. The presence made large-scale atrocities harder to commit with impunity. UNAMID documented human rights abuses. It provided logistical support to the humanitarian effort. While it failed to bring peace, UNAMID in El-Fashir arguably prevented things from becoming worse, saving lives by being there, if not always through action. Section 5. The ICC and the pursuit of justice. As the world grappled with how to stop the violence in Darfur, a parallel effort was underway to hold the perpetrators accountable. In March 2005, in a momentous move, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1593. This resolution referred the situation in Darfur to the International Criminal Court, or ICC, located in The Hague. This was the first time the Security Council had ever referred a case to the court. It gave the ICC's prosecutor the jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute individuals for the war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide allegedly committed in the region since 2002. The ICC Prosecutor's Office immediately launched a thorough investigation. Their investigators spent years collecting evidence, interviewing hundreds of witnesses in the refugee camps in Chad and other locations, and analyzing documents and satellite imagery. Their work methodically built a case that the atrocities in Darfur were not random acts of violence, but the result of a coordinated state policy. The investigation pointed directly to the highest levels of the Sudanese government and its allied militia leaders. El-Fashir, as a command center, featured prominently in their evidence. The investigation culminated in a series of historic legal actions. The ICC issued arrest warrants for several individuals: Ali Kushaib, Ahmed Haroun. Then, in a truly unprecedented step, the court issued an arrest warrant for a sitting head of state. In 2009, the ICC charged Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir with war crimes, crimes against humanity, later adding the charge of genocide in 2010. The court alleged that he bore ultimate responsibility for the campaign of murder, extermination, rape, forcible transfer of the population. The government in Khartoum and its officials in El-Fashir vehemently rejected the ICC's authority. They refused to surrender any of the suspects and launched a diplomatic campaign to discredit the court, portraying it as a tool of Western imperialism. While the arrest warrants did not immediately lead to the suspects facing trial, they had a profound impact. They isolated President al-Bashir on the world stage, limiting his ability to travel. Most importantly, for the victims in the camps, the ICC's actions represented a powerful acknowledgement of their suffering. It was a clear statement from the international community that there would be no impunity for the architects of the Darfur tragedy. Our journey through the recent history of El-Fashir and Darfur has revealed a story of immense complexity and profound human tragedy. We have traced the deep roots of the conflict, from the region's diverse geography, peoples, to its history of marginalization within the modern Sudanese state. We have seen how grievances over land, power, identity, exacerbated by environmental pressures and political manipulation, erupted into open rebellion. The rebels' audacious 2003 attack on El-Fashir served as the catalyst, triggering a state response of unparalleled brutality. The city was transformed from an administrative capital into the military and logistical heart of a devastating counterinsurgency campaign, one that deliberately targeted civilians. The core of this documentary has been to clarify the chain of events and the specific actions that defined this period. The facts are stark. From the command centers in El-Fashir, the Sudanese government and military unleashed and coordinated with the Janjaweed militias. They pursued a scorched earth strategy that emptied the countryside, destroying hundreds of villages and killing untold numbers of people. This campaign of terror created a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions, forcing hundreds of thousands of survivors into sprawling displacement camps on the city's outskirts. These camps, born of violence, became permanent features of the landscape, trapping a generation in a state of dependency and fear. The international response, though significant, was often a step behind the unfolding tragedy. The arrival of African Union peacekeepers in El-Fashir and later United Nations peacekeepers provided a measure of protection and observation, but they were unable to halt the violence or enforce a lasting peace. The Darfur Peace Agreement of 2006 failed, splintering the conflict into an even more chaotic and multi-sided war. The wheels of international justice turned slowly, the International Criminal Court issuing historic arrest warrants for the alleged architects of the violence, including the president himself, yet accountability on the ground remained elusive for the victims. What is clear from this history is the central role that El-Fashir played. It was not merely a backdrop to the conflict, but an active instrument within it. The decisions made by the leaders within the city had direct and fatal consequences for millions. They orchestrated attacks, obstructed aid, and presided over a system of mass displacement. While much of the world's attention has moved on, the ledger of these actions remains. The human cost, measured in lives lost, communities shattered and futures stolen, is staggering. The demographic re-engineering of Darfur, planned and executed through this conflict, has left a legacy that continues to shape the region today. The story of Darfur and of El-Fashir's role within it is not entirely closed. It is an ongoing narrative, with the lives of the displaced still hanging in a precarious and unresolved balance, as recent events in Sudan have tragically demonstrated once again. This documentary was created to provide a clear, factual and accessible account of a difficult chapter in recent history. We have used maps and a chronological timeline to bring clarity to a complex series of events. If you have found this careful and considered style of reporting valuable, we ask that you like this video and subscribe to our channel. Doing so helps support our ability to produce more in-depth documentaries that seek to inform rather than to sensationalize. For those who wish to review the sequence of events, a detailed, time-stamped timeline is available in the video description below for your reference. The story of what happened in Darfur, and specifically the actions directed from El-Fashir, is a sobering reminder of the devastating consequences of hatred, marginalization, and the abuse of power. It shows how quickly the fabric of a society can be torn apart when ethnic identity is weaponized for political ends. The international community's struggle to respond effectively also provides critical lessons about the limits of peacekeeping, sanctions and diplomacy in the face of a determined and ruthless government. These are lessons that remain profoundly relevant in our world today, as similar patterns of conflict continue to emerge in other regions. The final enduring thought is one of memory and responsibility. For the hundreds of thousands of people still living in the camps and for the global diaspora of Darfuris, the past is not a distant history lesson. It is a lived reality and an open wound. Forgetting their story would be the ultimate injustice. Remembering it and understanding the clear facts of what transpired is a shared responsibility. It is the necessary first step towards honoring the victims, pursuing justice, however delayed, and ensuring that the phrase "never again" is not just a hollow promise, but a genuine and enduring commitment. Final solemn cue.